Please let me introduce Barbara Fant this morning. As I'm sure all of you in Columbus know, Barbara is an award-winning poet, having competed in 9 national and world poetry slams, including 5 individual competitions and 4 national poetry slam teams. Her first poetry collection was published in 2010, and she has since published 2 chapbooks, both released in 2017. She is a featured artist in the Columbus Makes Art campaign, and Columbus Alive featured her as one of their 2017 People to Watch. She teaches poetry at Transit Arts and was an editor for Antioch University's literary journal, Lunch Ticket. Speaking this morning on the theme, Liminal, please join me in welcoming Barbara Fant. And you are hearing rapturous applause there, Barbara.
Thank you so much. I can hear and see all of the applause. So it's so great to be here with all of you today. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Brandy, for the recommendation. Brandy and I have a special connection, so I appreciate that. So glad to be here. So hi, guys. I'm going to talk to you about liminal spaces. I really appreciated the conversation that was taking place before we actually began, because I was like, oh, okay, that lets me know I'm kind of in the right vein of things. So this talk will be really a mix of me doing some poetry for you all, but then also kind of me talking about my experience. So I called it my healing journey through the liminal. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll share some slides in a little bit, but right now I just want to begin with a poem that I consider kind of a prayer, if that's okay. This sounded base of faith be holy. If this be holy ground, then the water on which I stood choked the sand out of me. I believed in galaxy, became burning night star, fell, cratered us on elbows, kneecaps of prayer promises, my testimony. Came warped in the guitar of my mother's casket, my father's brain chest, bent into crucifix, they called me oak, as if I bloomed from sacrifice. Even those demons knew me by name. I was breaking chains of generational curses, choking voices, butterfly trapped in the spiderweb of my throat. My spine was ladder. My dreams were reaching towards a more I didn't yet know. I swallowed balloon like hot air, resurrected into ball of fire, delivered from fire. The line between artistic and anointing, I walked on water in the belly of the waves, shed my scales, found I was slave to my own body. Silence can be so loud. Loud is often all I know of silence. My soul is of percussion. I am rhythm, saxophoned into trumpet bass, grounded of taste, surrounded by sound. But can I hear God's voice in the bass of my own faith? I said, can I hear God's voice in the bass of my own faith so often? Can I hear God's voice trapped inside the bass of my own faith? Thank you so much. I like to open with that piece, one, because it kind of gets my jitters out, right? It helps me with my nerves. But then also I thought it was kind of fitting to hear
the applause part.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that. That's very kind. Thank you. Yeah, poetry is prayer for me. It's been that for many, many years. And so I always like to kind of begin with that piece. And I felt like it was fitting when we were talking about the liminal, just being in that in-between space. So what I'm going to do, if it's okay, I am going to share my slides. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully I do this properly. Okay, here we go. Everybody can see that? Good. Okay. So this is my healing journey through the liminal, and hopefully it'll be something that you can take with you as well. So when we think about the liminal, this is kind of the definitions that we were actually talking about a little bit earlier, is that it comes from a word that means threshold. It means like feelings of tension and unease created by like a physical space or a considerable change. And it can also mean the physical spaces between one destination and the next, a transition of sorts. And that's something that we talked about earlier. So just so y'all know, I'm not like an anthropologist or anything like that. I'm not going to get into all of the nitty gritty of what this actually means, but I will talk about my personal journey through it. So I want y'all to know, my life has been a myriad of liminal stages. And I say stages, right? Because I don't think my life has been a myriad of liminal minutes. I feel like it's been stages. There's been so many moments in my life where I've experienced states of transition, states of confusion, states of fear, trying to figure out what's happening, which state am I going to? I know when they talk about like a physical space, when you think about the liminal, oftentimes they'll say it's like a hallway, right? Or some kind of like corridor, right? And where you have to cross over from one space to the next. And for my life, I've gone through extreme losses. I lost my mother when I was 15, which actually thrusted me into like a writing process. I ended up having to change my homes many different times. I ended up moving many different places. I ended up leaving toxic relationships, right? Making the decision to come out of one space and go into another. So I feel like my life has been made up of this state of liminal stages. So I wanted to think about like how we see these moments. I feel like what helps us is to see these moments in a different way. I feel like a lot of times it's about perspective. So when I was going through these spaces, I asked myself, did I choose this space or did this space choose me? And the second thing that I asked myself was, would I decide to see this space as a roadblock or an opportunity? I appreciated a comment that was brought up earlier about how we can get stuck in these spaces, right? Sometimes we're stuck there. Sometimes they can be complete roadblocks, but I think we have the opportunity to choose whether or not it's going to stay and remain a roadblock, or whether or not we're going to use this space as an opportunity to shift and move to something different. So with that, I'm gonna share another poem. I'm gonna stop my share just so that I can see all of y'all. And I'm gonna read this poem that I feel like I actually wrote this poem in the midst of a really big transitional phase in my life. I was leaving a really, really dark space, a really dark relationship. And I was able to connect with an organization called Maroon Arts Group, which is in the city. And we put together this show called Black Staccato. And I ended up writing this piece, and this piece was kind of like one of the catalysts for that show. So it's called House of Dust. You will build a house out of dust until you realize that the home is within you. When I realized I was being swallowed, it was too late. I saw the bullet swallow the wind and remembered how the clouds held up the sky. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I'm reminded that it's just that, a shadow, that these dry bones can still rise on tomorrow. Told death, you thought you had all of me. How I buried my mother at 15. Watched my brother take his last breath at 17, visited my father on psych floors of hospital rooms for years. Then I ran into houses of men disguised like homes. You will build a house out of dust until you realize that the home is within you. When you pain out loud and there's pain in your body the size of a whale stuck inside the whale, my body drifts and floats around me. Tell Jonah how I swallowed myself in the belly of my own fear and woke up swimming in the reality of my insecurity scales. Now all I see is shadow of myself. I lived broken girl and made all the wrong choices. How I moved out of my house and her house to his house and the hotels and couches, from home to home to house to house. To where is my home? Is there a home etched inside a staccato for me? And oh Lord, I want to forgive the man who raised his hand. Forgive the broken Black boy who had his back broken, so he broke mine. Failed to see I was ribbed, so he broke my spine. Forgive the Black boy broken, whose daddy loved him hollow. So he hunts for housewives made of sheepskin and tongueless mouths. Father, forgive him, for he knows not what he does. And Father, forgive me, for I knew not who I was. I flooded my bones with suicide. And every demon who whispered into my eardrum staccato opinions that almost swallowed me whole. How I learned how to build a house out of dust until I realized that the home was within me. Then one day, I stopped doing all the things I thought I had to do. Stopped being all the things I thought I needed to be, and remembered how I could write myself out of my own skin. My mouth, a boundary worth breaking. Remembered what it was like to have poems written into me, to write myself into a poem so thick it spills salvation, to cough so many poems from my lungs that it creates sanctuary. And yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will no longer fear myself. How this life of mine was disrupted, but not over. And the light in me is a light in whom I serve, and what a sacrifice to go to every dark place and have to write life back into your life just for someone else to breathe. And oh, Jonah, I know you ran from what will carve you holy, for you didn't understand that the calling will always outrun you. My chaos was birthed in every ounce of normalcy I thought I needed to be. My freedom was found in just being me. So here is where I throw up my hands and tell myself to dance until every piece of devil that was burned within me falls into landing. When the neighbors told me of my house, I said my house of dust blew up in flames while I was inside, but I survived. Told them of the shadows, showed them my scales, that I was searching for a house through all of this dust until I learned how to find the home within myself. All right. Oh, thank you guys. I appreciate that. Let's get back to the presentation. Back to my slides. So when we were talking earlier, we were talking about like what these spaces can do for us. And I feel like in that poem, I'm talking about like what that space did for me. It helped ground me. And I think that's what these spaces can do for us, right? They can help ground us. They can help us become more centered. They can also help define us, not just who we are, but who we want to become. And then the second or the third piece of this is we get to choose. We get to choose what we're going to take with us to that next phase, right? We could take a bunch of baggage with us if we want to. We could take that grief or that shame. We could take harmful situations, loved ones that have harmed us, maybe exes, or we can choose to take love and forgiveness and joy with us through the other side. And so I'm going to walk kind of us through like what I decided to do with what I call our liminal year. Because we talked about a little bit earlier, I feel like all of us have lived through this liminal state of COVID and having to shift and change through that. And so I wanted to take y'all through kind of my last year and a half, 2 years. How long we've been in COVID, y'all? It's been a long time, but I'm gonna take y'all kind of through some of the things that I did throughout my process through our liminal year. So when I think about my healing journey, I chose to create through COVID. That's one of the things that I pushed myself to do, is I pushed myself to create. The second thing that I did was I leaned into creativity. With my income, I looked for multiple streams of income. I expanded spaces through my faith. And then the third piece of that is that I chose joy. Like I said, I feel like we have an opportunity to choose. And I decided to be intentional about choosing joy in that space. And so I'll talk about that a little bit later. This is one of the first things that I did. And I want to talk about the collective. You'll see a bunch of beautiful faces of some Black women on this space. So at the very beginning of the pandemic, I told myself that I wanted to remain creative and that I was going to push myself to remain creative. And so what I did was I reached out to about 14 Black and brown women who were writers in the city. And I was like, hey, how about y'all go on a journey with me? Let's write a poem a day. And not just for like 30 days, let's try for like 40 days. And we did it. We actually just used each other as accountability partners. We wrote a poem a day and we were accountable like to each other. We just submitted it every day online to each other. And what happened from that is that people didn't want to stop. They were like, well, we want resources. We want to like stay connected. We want to do this. We want to do that. So we became what we have now called the Black Woman Rise Poetry Collective. In March of actually earlier this year, Susan Bradford invited us to perform for the Backstage series. So this is like one of the first events that opened up out of COVID. The event actually was hybrid. We sold tickets online and in person, and it became this collective that we're now running. Now we're partnered with Freedom a la carte, and we're able to run open mics. We're able to run workshops with the women at Freedom a la carte, and it's just been an exciting process. And who would have known that that's something that would have come out of COVID? The second thing that I did was I decided to further develop my business, and not just to poetry and speaking, but also I started doing work with nonprofits, actually like consulting with nonprofits. And so it just really worked out. I want to show y'all my logo because I'm so proud of it. And this kind of actually came out of COVID. And Marshall Shorts, who I'm sure most of y'all know, was the one behind this logo. And we really worked together and kind of ironed this out. And he came up with this design, which is kind of 2 Bs. But then if you look at it again, it's like an 8, I feel like, which is like a number of completion. So it really just worked out. But I dove into further in my business, and I ended up expanding my resources in ways that I didn't really expect. I also landed a book deal, y'all. I landed a book deal, and I actually worked really hard in this. This is my new collection. It's actually out next month. The pre-order is, you can pre-order it now, actually. But I do want to just shout out April Tsunami, actually, who did this cover. Some of y'all may know April Tsunami, incredible artist in the city. And I worked towards that. I chose to not kind of dive into a hole. I chose to not be stuck. And I pushed myself to create. And this is one of the things that came out of that. So shout out to Sundress Publications that is publishing this collection. The next thing I did, and this will kind of like lead me into the next part of my journey, was I ended up contracting with the Arts for Healing and Justice Network. So some of you may know, some of you may not know that my work, a lot of my healing informed arts work has been embedded in the justice system and inside incarceration. So I work inside youth and adult correctional institutions, teaching art as a form of healing. Throughout COVID, I ended up contracting with an organization called the Arts for Healing and Justice Network. It's a network of arts organizations that are dedicated towards using art as a strategy for healing and wellness for like the juvenile justice system, but then also for young people in community. And they reached out and said, hey, do we have capacity to do this in Ohio? And because of the work that I was doing, I was able to contract with them. And so now we have a network in Ohio of arts organizations who are dedicated towards this work. We also just finished our first teaching artist training, which is really exciting. We also partnered with Franklin County. So one of the things that came out of this too is that one of the judges at the youth courts reached out to me before COVID and asked if I could bring some artists inside to help like beautify the space in a way. And so because of COVID hit, we couldn't go inside. So I reached back out. I said, hey, can those funds be used in a different way? And so we were able to utilize those funds to build arts programming for young people who are incarcerated. And we're doing that program actually now, still virtually. And so that was one of the things that came out of it. For all of us who lived through the pandemic, that was an incredibly liminal space, right? For a lot of us, there was what we call the pandemic inside the pandemic, with the uprisings and everything that was happening around the murders of so many, but especially George Floyd. And so I wanted to kind of bring this into this space because this is something that all of us lived through as well. And so many of us could have shrunk in this space. So many of us could have become stuck, but so many of us took to the streets. And I think that that's an important piece of this as well. I wanted to uplift one of the murals that was put together by David Butler at an arts school in Cincinnati. And so that's what you'll see on the left. And he actually used one of my poems to do it. Of course, we know there were tons of murals that went around. And so I'll show you guys just a few. And then this is a piece also I got asked to speak at one of the marches. This was the Women's March that took place downtown. Yes, that's what I'll say about that. These are the next 2 pieces that I wanted to share. And I think what I'm also trying to stress is that so much of this work, this is work that came out of COVID. And it's not just like my work. There's so many of us artists who decided we're not going to sit down. We're artists. We're going to create. Artists are still going to do what they do. And so I felt that it was fitting to talk about this for Creative Mornings, especially when we're talking about the liminal space. And so on the left here, I want to show you a painting that was done by Brian Moss. This is at the McConnell Art Center. If y'all know Aaron Blue, that's Aaron Blue holding this painting. And this is one of my poems called But Tonight. And then to the right is one of the murals that was put up downtown. This is by an artist, Stephanie Rond. This was when a lot of the glass was broken out down at the Ohio Theater, and there were many murals that were put up. This was one of them. And Stephanie reached out to me and she said, hey, I want you to write a poem for one of the murals that I'm putting together. And I said, I would love to, but I can't do that without the voice of other women. And so I just want to shout out the other women who helped me write this piece, Dion Custer Edwards, Taisha Radford Short, Cynthia Amoa, and Bahira and Nafisa Malik. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to read this poem. It's called Our Lady Justice. She stands, armored in melanin's perfection, glares pain in the face, holds our future in her eyes, wisdom arched in her spine as America, shaped like glass and possible, gathers its flesh and shards. She stands, swallows swords of outrage whole, fire breather. Our Lady be the fire, won't burn out when the weight of injustice equals the cost of Black life. Black freedom guides creation, strength shines still. As silence silences itself, she stands in center of it all, whispering, there will be peace, there will be joy. And then I want to take you to something else that I did throughout COVID. And I think this came out of the liminal space, which was I moved across the country to Los Angeles. So that organization, the Arts for Healing Injustice Network, remember how we had a network that was built in Ohio? They actually contracted me on and hired me on full time to do that work. And so now we're able to build networks in San Diego, New Mexico, Ohio, New York, and we'll be moving into a few other states soon as well. And so I wanted to just share some actual pictures of me traveling to LA. I packed everything up in my little 2017 Hyundai Elantra with didn't fit, didn't go, and my friend and I trucked it west. And it was a really important time in my life. And I feel like that space in itself, just this transition and making the choice to make that transition was a liminal space as well. This is something that I kind of want to leave us with. And it is this reality that it's something like, that statement, we don't get to choose what happens to us, but we can choose how we respond. Is very similar. We don't get to choose what happens to us, but these liminal moments in our lives, they're bound to show up, but we get to choose how we see them. We get to choose what kind of perspective we're going to see them with, what kind of lens we're going to use to see them, and whether or not we get stuck or whether or not we make that shift to do something different. We get to choose joy, y'all. Joy is important. I say joy because I was intentional about choosing joy throughout COVID. That's one of the things that I did as well. I actually helped run some workshops around joy. And this is the definition I'm using, just so you know, when I'm talking about joy, this is what I mean. And this is a quote the poet Khalil Gibran actually spoke this, and Lupita Nyong'o, the actress, actually was quoting him, and I plucked it from that interview. And the quote is, joy is not the absence of pain, but it's happiness in spite of it. Joy is not the absence of pain, but it's happiness in spite of it. And I think about that when we're, thinking about these liminal spaces. It doesn't mean that the pain isn't there. It doesn't mean that the darkness isn't there. But it means that happiness can coexist with that. And in the belly of that is where you get joy, when you push. And so I wanted to leave us with that. I always talk about why joy, why do we choose joy? And this is a quote by one of the most incredible writers that ever lived, Toni Morrison. The function of freedom is to set someone else free. And I feel like when we choose joy, it leads us to this space of freedom. And when we become free, we get the opportunity to set other people free as well. I'm going to leave us with this last poem, if that's all right with y'all. It is a poem that I wrote actually when I was working with Harmony Project as the artistic director, which I was throughout COVID. And it is a poem, I think, that speaks to humanity. And I was talking a lot about COVID and coming out of that in this space. So I'll just read it. It's called Harmony of Our Own. When the storm comes and those who have already felt forgotten feel forgotten. Another level of isolation, bars built around bars, how even in the same room, we must place 6 feet between our loved ones, not alone, but still lonely. Fear, an unfisted clutch around your neck, your mind, an open field of confusion, grief, life, a revolving door, a treadmill you can't seem to get off. To be human is to sometimes be the train and the track, the cathedral and the crescendo all in one breath in times like this. Is even heaven restless? Is time an internal reflection, the let go and let God reminder of the God in us that survivor is the song we were born into, the fire we will walk out of, the fight deep inside. Faith is a torch we carry in our spines, reminds us to stand and light the path for someone else's tomorrow, to see the purpose in today. And here we are, still of breath and standing, humbled and still alive. How prayer, it changes things. Hope is a song we sing ourselves into. And this too, yes, even this too shall pass. Through every storm, there is a cloud that cracks the sky, tosses our rain backwards into the air and shows us the sun. It always shines. There is always hope. Our rib cages are windows for light, where we call each other back home. This is how we heal. This is how we hope. Break ourselves into the songs of each other and find a harmony of our own. And with that last poem, I wouldn't be who I am if I didn't leave you guys with a little bit of a prompt. And this is the prompt that I actually used a lot throughout COVID. And I won't give a space or time to write today because we don't have that, but I want to leave this prompt with you and you can feel free to write it down. So I want you to think about what has kept you alive or what has helped you survive throughout this past season in your life. What is that has kept you alive or helped you survive throughout this past season? Whether that be a person, place, or thing, it can be a spouse, a partner, it could be your home, it could be a pet, whatever it is, right? It could be writing, if that's what it was, or music. And then I want you to write a letter of gratitude from the perspective of that person, place, or thing back to you. Write a letter of gratitude or thanksgiving from the perspective of that person, place, or thing back to you. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you all so much for having me today. Really, really grateful and feel really blessed and honored to be here. So thank you.
Oh, we are blessed and honored to be sure, Barbara. When I think when we were putting together speakers, I think I was among the leaders in this, saying we need to have a poet. We need to have like a really good poet be a speaker this year. And I think we most certainly found a really good poet. Thank you again, Barbara. We've left some time for questions, and you must have questions. Please write those in the chat. We'll try to get to as many of these as we can in the time available to us. I'd like to start, if I may, Barbara. I was so appreciative of your performances this morning. I wonder, well, first of all, have you been doing performances like this over Zoom because of the pandemic? And I wonder what that experience is like. mean, there's a part of me, I mean, I loved hearing these poems, but there was another part of me that thought, boy, I wish we were in a space someplace. I wish we were, I don't know, the Lincoln Theater or something, and we're hearing this live. What's it been like, I guess, to perform over Zoom, and is it a different sort of performance for you?
It is. It's hard. Performing over Zoom is hard because as many hearts and as much, as many of the claps that you can get, you still lose that energy. You don't feel it. There's nothing like being in a space with people giving and receiving. And I think as performers, we feed off of that energy. We give it to you and the audience gives it back. And it's a reciprocal thing. And of course, you don't necessarily have that in Zoom. It's very, one dimensional, right? You're not able to have that. But the blessing, I think, that came out of that space is that you can be in a different state or in a different city in a matter of seconds. We have a friend from Belgium right here today, and one of the things I think that I thought about actually through COVID is like, oh my goodness, like one night I was in Chicago, I was in Texas, and then I wonder if it was Brooklyn, it was somewhere in New York, I can't remember. In the same night, it was 3 different readings. And so I think that's one of the things too, I was able to feature in different states without having to physically go anywhere. So you get to build these connections, and we're so thankful that we have this. But as a performer, I'm ready to be back in person with people.
What do you do differently over Zoom, if anything, versus say something that's live or actual human beings around you?
I think I hype myself up probably a little bit more than I would, maybe in person. In person, I know I'm going to get that energy. So when I'm by myself, I'm like reading it multiple times. I'm reading it in the mirror to myself a little bit more than I probably would. But other than that, that's it. I will say maybe I try to coach the audience typically. I didn't in this space, but like if I'm running a reading or if I'm doing something else with other poets, especially, I usually try to say, make sure you give it up for the poet, make sure you throw your hearts up, make sure you clap, just so that people they know that they have the permission to give as much energy as they can in this space.
Brandy, it's amazing what you just wrote in the chat, because that was literally my next question. Just as Brandy, I was intrigued by this idea of the space that chooses you. Can you say a little more about that?
Sure. I think when we are on our life journeys, I just believe in the divine and the divine timing of things. Also, I don't think that things happen by accident. And that's just a personal belief of mine. And so when we're in those spaces, even the negative spaces or even the dark spaces, the hard and challenging spaces, I try to look at it as, man, I try not to be like, oh my gosh, I'm going through this thing. It's so hard. It's so tough. It's so challenging. I try to think like, no, this space arrived and I'm going to rise to it. And maybe I didn't just walk into this thing, but maybe this thing actually chose me to be able to walk through. And I know that there's so many times in my life where I feel like the people that I was born to, the family that I was born in, the relationships that I'm in, the opportunity to use my gift in this way, it chose me. I didn't necessarily choose it.
In one of your poems, and forgive me, I forget which one it was.
Okay.
There was the line, "Poems written into me," and I'd like to hear a little bit more about that line.
Yeah, that is a line from House of Dust, and I just believe that there have been like kind of like what I was saying earlier, just about the real divine and this belief that our journeys in a lot of ways are written. that we get the opportunity to kind of walk them out, but a lot of times they're written. But I'm a person of faith. And so I believe that every journey and every space, a poem just is not just with a sonnet or, a pantoum or just what us stringing words together. Poems, I believe, are these life experiences. And I believe that so many life experiences have been written into me, and they pour out of me. And so when I'm thinking about poems, oftentimes I talk a lot about prayers too. Sometimes I use that synonymously. And yeah, so I think that's what I mean and what I'm talking about when I say poems written into me.
And tell us a little more about that that connection between prayer and poetry.
Sure. I started writing when I was really, really young. I think I was always drawn to writing and the love for the word in that way. But when my mother passed and I was 15, I really couldn't talk to anybody. I was an angry teenager. I used to fight. I did a lot of things. And I couldn't talk to God either. I wanted to go to counseling and my dad was like, no, you're going to church. That was his way of handling things. And I didn't know how to pray. I couldn't really do it. So I started to write. And it was in that process of writing that it became this way of prayer for me. And I began to talk to God, and not only talk to God, but be able to process things myself internally. So I was talking to myself. I was talking to other people I couldn't have conversations with. I was talking to my mother, whom I couldn't have a conversation with anymore. And for me, that writing process became this process of prayer.
Brandy asks, what are your favorite poems, or who are the poets that inspire you?
Oh goodness, too many to name, right? But what I will start with is a poet that I initially saw on, if y'all remember HBO Def Poetry. I don't know if y'all remember Russell Simmons used to have a show called HBO Def Poetry.
Very vaguely, I remember this. Yes.
Yeah. So when I was in high school, that show was on, and I saw a poet named Sonny Patterson, poet out of New Orleans, and she did a poem called "We Made It." And I was like, oh my goodness, I don't know who she is or what the heck she just did, but I want to do what she did for the rest of my life. And when I'm from Youngstown, Ohio, when I moved to Columbus for college, I got on a stage at Black Pearl Poetry at the Brownstone, used to be the Brownstone downtown, and I haven't left the stage since. And so she's somebody that really incredibly inspired me. So many poets that I can name, though, poets in our city: Hanif Abdul-Karib, Will Evans, Tiffany Smith, Mahogany Brown out of New York, who published my first book and took me under her wings as a mentor, Khadijah Queen, Andrea Gibson, Rachel McKibbins. I mean, I could list them off and keep going, but those are a lot of my favorites, especially the greats, Sonia Sanchez, one of the greats, June Jordan, Yusuf Komunyakaa, completely shifted my brain when thinking about metaphor. He's one of my favorites for sure.
You've already touched on this, but I wanted to explore in more detail, if you're willing and able. I'm very interested in your creative process. And any artist I interact with or any artist I interview, I would love to know more about your creative process.
Yes, I'm trying to think of even how I can begin that, but a lot of times there are images that come to my mind that become metaphors, dreams, images, and they become somewhat of a metaphor for a story that I may not have yet. And there are other times that I have the story that's coming out of me, or it's what I would consider pouring out of me. It's pouring out of my body, but I don't have the actual metaphors for it yet. And I'm trying to build that. So my creative process is that I'm writing all the time. Oftentimes I try to write every day. I try to at least get something on paper every day, whether that's a metaphor, or image, or a full line, or a full poem. I try to do that just for me in my personal practice. And so I'm constantly building stories that way. I also, over the years, I have been pulled into doing a lot of commission work, especially for organizations. And in that process is a little bit different because I'm usually pulling the stories that they want to tell and trying to build using the metaphors from some of the imagery that they've given to make it into a metaphor and build the story that way. And I'm trying to tell the story of an organization or of another person for the purpose of their event. So that process is a little different.
Wow, thank you for that.
Mhm.
Aubrey's just asked, what brings you comfort in times of significant change?
Mm. Honestly, it is, I have a strong faith in God, and that is what brings me comfort, knowing that I don't know all the things, that I may not know what awaits me, but I know that there is a God who controls it all and who knows my comings and my goings more than I do. And so that's what I rest in. Um, and that brings me comfort. And then I think also I have really great family and friends that I'm able to lean on in times of discomfort and change, that I know when I don't even have my back, they do. They have my back. And I lean on them. I lean on community in a big way. Something I probably should have said even through the presentation is that so many of those transitions and those changes, I would not have made it through without the power of my community. You probably heard me shout out, Maroon Arts Group and Transit Arts and so many of those organizations that those are my friends, real friends that are in those spaces. And we lean on each other. So that brings me comfort.
Can I ask one more question? I like to ask one more question.
Yeah,
And this is purely of my own sort of interest. So you talk about writing every day, writing something, whatever that is. And I always tell myself, I'm going to do that too. I'm going to write every day. And it never sort of works out that way for me. I tend to write in these panicked last minute sort of, the deadline is, tomorrow. And so out comes the writing. How do you get into, how do you create a space for yourself to do that? What sort of preparation do you have to go through or just the discipline to be able to do that?
That's good. I probably don't have much preparation. Sometimes it is me laying in my bed and I'm like typing a line on my phone, right? And so I think for me, it's just trying to do it and make it happen, and to either type it on your phone, text it to yourself, or record it. If you just like walking through somewhere and you like, I need to write something, and a thought comes to your mind, just record it. Because you're writing. That's you writing. And there's also, I want to say this too. I think it was Khadijah Queen that told me this at Antioch, actually. And she said, even when you're not writing, you're writing. So even when you're not writing, you're writing. Creators, even when you're not creating, you're creating. And to hold that, with yourself, and to know that as you're moving forward in this world, you know what, I may not always be physically doing it, but I'm doing it. It's working itself in you. So maybe that's what I'm talking about too. When those poems are being written into, they're writing themselves in me. The work is writing itself and creating itself in you, even when you're not actively doing it.
Barbara, thank you again for speaking with us this morning. As you were talking and performing, I thought to myself, what we need right now at this moment is more poetry, and I think and more poets. And I think that this is going to be my biggest takeaway from this today. Barbara, thank you again very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks to everyone who came. I appreciate that.